You're listening to the Real Platform podcast sponsored by Ampliance and Klaviyo. Today you're listening to myself, James Gurd, and my magical co-host, Paul Rogers. How are you doing, sir?
Getting there. I've got COVID, but it's finally got me. But aside from that, all good.
Yeah, how are you feeling? You sound good.
Yeah, pretty good overall. I think initially I had like the whole cloudy brain thing, but yeah, mostly good. I think I've just got cabin fever now because I don't usually spend too much time at home, and I've been stuck here for a week. But
that kind of brain thing, I have that every day, so I can't pin that on having had COVID before. It's just a natural ability. But welcome to our any new listeners. Thank you for joining us. If this is your first time on the podcast, we hope you enjoy it. And thanks, as always, to all our regular listeners for tuning back in. We hope you find this episode interesting as well. If you want to get episode alerts, do subscribe. And we'd love a like on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, etc., to give us a warm glow on a Friday. And just to throw something completely different in this week, I heard a really good joke last night. I thought I'd share this. So, Paul, why can't you trust atoms?
Why?
They make up everything. There's a geeky scientific techie joke to start the day. Right, so let's move on to the topic for today. So we are talking about de-risking e-commerce technology projects, which is such an important part of technology selection, technology implementation, whether that's re-platforming e-commerce platforms or any other systems you're doing. So what we're going to cover is why you need to accept risk, sensible approach to risk mitigation, and common e-commerce project risks and how to de-risk them. Is that a fair enough setup for what we're doing today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an important topic. Like so many people at the minute seem to be trying to kind of justify re-platforming projects and plan for re-platforming projects. I think it's a really good one.
Cool. So I'm going to start by saying about why you need to accept risk. And then I'm going to ask you the simple question of how do you get your clients to understand that they need to accept risk? So number one is all projects with people and technology have risk. Technology can go wrong. People can make bad decisions. People can get ill. There's all sorts of things that can turn what was a smooth process into a slightly bumpy one. And there's foreseen and unforeseen. So a good example, a foreseen is a business has decided to implement a new ERP, and that coincides with an e-commerce development timeframe. That adds risk to the projects because of the interdependencies. Unforeseen is your project manager suddenly hands in their notice midway through the project, and all of a sudden those processes and that control that you've relied on is suddenly not there, and you've got to manage around it. If you don't do risk management and mitigation, you have to then react on the fly, which can add more stress into the project. So, but what are your tips? How do you communicate with clients? How do you get them to buy into this at the start? Risk is an element of the project.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important phase, and I think you've added a couple of points here that I think are good, which is, build the risk register and evaluation process and create kind of escalation paths. I think it's probably an area you're a lot stronger in than I am. I tend to be a bit more scrappy, which definitely has downsides on this side. But I think really from my perspective, I think clarity is everything, documentation is everything. And I think just in terms of resourcing a re-platforming project, I think where you can, if you can kind of decouple scopes of work and make sure you've got specialists that have got enough time to deliver, I think that's always a good one. But then equally, we were talking earlier about the benefits of having less kind of people to manage. So yeah, I guess that goes either way. But from my perspective, I think that definitely helped. Just kind of making sure you've got the right team to deliver the really high risk areas, which we'll go on to.
Yeah, I think I find this as well. I always start a project by the kickoff workshop having risk as a key discussion point and talking about these are the most common risks. Have you identified risks yet? Have you thought about how you mitigate any risk, and getting people to have that as a conversation, and it becomes a stream within the project. And you're right, risk registers sounds dull, is dull, but so important. It doesn't matter. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, an Excel RAID log, but just have risks documented and numbered and identified and have owners and follow up on it. The most important thing is a process, because we talked about this before we went on air. You've seen this before where risks are nailed down and everyone says, hey, look, we've done a great job. We've done our risk register. 6 months later, they've forgotten about it. And there was no plan in place to address one of those key risks, or the plan was defined, but nobody followed up on it. Or a risk register was created, but no one gave it to the project manager. So really, really important. And then the bit that's linked into that, which is essential, is escalation paths. You might have a risk that you're trying to mitigate and action some tasks around, but there are blockers elsewhere in the business and people aren't on board or aren't supportive or don't think it's a priority. There's got to be a way to escalate up to get that resolved at a project board level. Even if you're a small business and your project board is you plus one other, it's just having somebody at the senior level of decision making who can unpick blockages that could end up derailing the project later on. And then I think the other thing is, I always advise people is be sensible. You might identify 8 risks and you might think, we can't mitigate all of these. So which risks are you willing to live with? And which you can't. A good example of where you can't is if you currently have processes that aren't fit for purpose around things like GDPR, you need to be compliant, because the risk of not being compliant is not only like potential brand damage or frustrated customers, but it's also big fines. So you've got to nail down the risks that you can't mess around with, and the risks where you can go, do you know what, we've understood it, we know what the impact might be, but it's minimal, we accept it, we're not going to try and spend a load of resource on fixing it. So with that in mind, let's dive into some common e-commerce risks and how we mitigate them. So the first one I chucked down, so I'm interested in your thoughts, Paul, is when you've got to leave an existing agency development partner. What do you do about when do you tell them? Do you tell them? Do you not tell them? And this comes up every project.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a massive one and a really good one from you. I think for me, you're right, it does come up. I think if you can, I think you should tell them as early as possible. I think you should, think about your rationale, think about how you're communicating it, try and justify it as much as possible, try and be as good to the existing provider as possible, make sure, if you're allocating tasks to them whilst you're going through the build, you're not kind of questioning every estimate, etc. So just try and make it a good exit. But from my perspective, I think I've seen people not fail, but definitely make things harder by getting things like order data and customer data really late in the project. They don't want to, alert the agency, or, not really understanding the way certain modules have been built, because again, they just don't want to raise any alarm bells. And I think the earlier you tell the agency, the more likely it is that they'll cooperate, and the more, valuable context you can get from the existing agency. Like we just did a project where actually the client was getting really worried about telling the agency, and they told them, I don't know, maybe 2 months before we ended up launching. And they were actually really valuable when it came to that final 2 months. But they were helping a lot, even little things like they controlled the DNS, and just being able to get as much kind of context around that side early as possible was really valuable. And yeah, I think I've rarely seen it go wrong when you tell an agency. I think the agency can be frustrated. I think, they might, their estimates might be a bit more like, I don't know, realistic or potentially higher than usual. But I think that 9 times out of 10, there's a benefit to telling the agency early.
Yeah, I agree. I think the highest risk of not telling is exactly that, right, they've stitched us up, we're deprioritizing, you're not getting the resource. And then when people say, well, we need to get all of our content migrated out, we need all of our data, and them saying, well, either it's extortionate, or we can't guarantee we can get it to you in time because we don't have the resource, because you haven't asked us for it. Exactly. I think transparency is critical, and it's also about maintaining a good reputation in the market. And it's really important for agencies and clients alike is to not be viewed as a client who is duplicitous with agencies and treats them bad, because people talk. It does get around. It can impact you in the future in selections. My one caveat, having seen this in one project, is where the existing relationship was so toxic, literally at daggers the whole time, where the client perceived the risk of telling far higher than the risk of not telling, because it enabled them in the background, because they had lots of systems access, to do a lot of the extraction work and preparation work to de-risk the final tell-in to the agency. And they stuck to the contractual terms of notice and minimise the period of volatility. So I think there's always caveats, but I agree with you, is if you have a at least halfway decent relationship with your existing agency, out of decency to them, being transparent and honest pays. What's the next one? So you flagged up team and capacity as a risk.
Yeah, so I think in terms of de-risking a project, the reason I wrote this one down. So I think in terms of de-risking a project, the best thing you can do is bring more people in typically, because I think, again, 8 times out of 10, it'll be the client that delays the project, or maybe 7 times out of 10. But I think, and usually that's because there's certain bottlenecks in the business that might own integrations or own, product data or whatever else. And I think if you can bring in additional resource and increase certain people's capacity. It might be that you bring in resource to handle the day-to-day or, trading or whatever else. But I think the more you free people up that are important to the project and the more specialists you bring in that have time available, the less risk there is in a project. And I think that especially applies also to the discovery as well, because quite often discoveries are rushed due to people not having time. And ultimately, the more you free up time from key people, the less risk there is of a project failing or being late.
Yeah, I think there's such an important point is if people haven't gone through this before, they can really easily underestimate how much time it will take. It feels quite light at the start because, we've got a development agency doing this, but then you start getting into the change management and into your content, into your UAT, and you realise how much time is needed to deliver into the development queue. So I think that's essential, and it's having conversations at the right level with senior management who own the team's resourcing to be able to say you need to allocate and be realistic with your team so that they are dedicated on this X amount per week, and you need to ramp it up in these periods. Yeah, definitely. Which links on to one of the next points, which is project management, because poorly managed projects descend into chaos. And it's either because lack of project management resources or lack of competencies at some of the core skills. So I'll pull out a couple, and I'm interested to hear your view on this. So the reality is that when you look at project races, the roles, accountability, etc., there has to be project management, and that's not just technical managing the development teams, but it's also managing business stakeholders so they're coordinated and they know what they've got to deliver and when, so that development queues don't get blocked, unstopped, and you suddenly end up, you need extra 2 or 3 sprints to get stuff done. Smaller teams don't have a lot of stakeholders, and often they don't have very rarely have a project manager in the house. But it means trying to look at whether there is somebody within the existing team who has got basic organisation skills, who can coordinate and work effectively. Are they good at talking across teams, getting people on board, getting them to do stuff? And it's allocating some of their time. In larger teams, it's thinking about, do you know what? It's going to be very hard for one person who's already doing their day-to-day to then do this across multiple stakeholders and teams. Let's look at a contractor project manager who's had experience of e-commerce migrations. You can take that pain away. For businesses with lots of interdependent projects where there's dependencies between e-commerce, it might be ERP, CRM, then people would look at recruiting a dedicated internal PM because there's efficiencies of them working across those projects in the business and being the interface to the stakeholders and to external agencies. So I think it's too often people don't think about the project management. They just say, hey, look, we'll chuck these people into the project. We've got an agency. And then it starts to come unglued later on when people realise they don't have the time to get stuff done and the project is going further and further off track.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just making sure you, in addition to the obvious, task management, timeline management, I think it's about given someone enough time to work with all the stakeholders and understand, progress, capacity, being able to react to newness, because often, as you're going through a project, that suddenly there'll be a new requirement or, something that has been planned isn't fit for purpose or whatever else. And basically just being able to build that in, constantly, adapting timeline, adapting scope, adapting budget. So I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, I typically, unless it's a really, really small business with a very simple project where you can get away with doing project management at basic level within the team and relying on the technical PM in the agency to do the structured project plan, I always advise businesses to get a PM allocated, even if it's a contractor for like 6 months, because it gives the business team, I know it's a cost, but you've got to think about the benefit. The risk of not having project management is the project descends into chaos. You get inefficiency, information's not ready for when the developers need it. you end up pushing the timeframes out. You might not get the right information. Things get built that aren't to spec. Then you have to change it. You end up with additional sprints and additional costs. So often you can offset a lot of the cost of project manager in this way, and that becomes a business case. But it takes the stress away from the project owners and the leading stakeholders. They're not having to worry about, oh my God, what have I got to do when have I got to provide this? They're just being asked, you've got three tasks, I'm managing it for you. You just give me this information by this date. And I think it helps de-stress internal teams.
I think what you just said there is a really important one as well that people never talk about, is the de-stressing of people is really important, because the amount of times I've seen big re-platforms be completed and then the team is depleted, essentially. So, people have gone through frustrations, gone through stress, and then essentially moved on afterwards. And sometimes it's because they've gone through a project, etc. But I do think that the de-stressing of key people within the business probably has a lot more value. And I think the other thing with some of these roles is it might feel like a luxury, and it might be like, okay, we can get it over the door anyway. But I think the difference between getting something completed and something being completed to like the highest possible standard and not cutting corners around some of the like ancillary areas, I think it can actually make a difference.
100%. And this is all about business cases, right? You don't just chuck money at stuff without understanding the cost and benefit. But I've seen it in another client at the moment, and they are 2 months late now. And it's primarily down to complications in the ERP, but they don't have an internal project manager. And it was one of the things we flagged right at the start is spend the money, but the business didn't want to. Fair enough. But you have to understand the implication. And one of the reasons they're so far down the line is also content readiness, which we'll come on to, is suddenly realizing how much effort. And one person is having to do all the project management, all of the tasks, all of the content. And it's just impossible and the stress levels go up and up and up. So, yeah, I always think that, well, actually, if you know that one of the reasons you're moving platform is to fix issues, get better technology, faster sites, which helps with your conversion and your attention to and you're going to be three months late by not doing it. Well, actually, what's the cost, the opportunity cost in terms of lost potential revenue over those 3 months? Well, that's your project manager.
No, I agree. Completely agree.
So let's move on to the next one, which I know you'll have a lot to say on, integrations, especially like ERP.
Yeah, so this is obviously one of the biggest ones that causes issues throughout a project. So, one of the hardest ones to plan around, obviously one of the biggest risks, I think. And also, I think usually whenever I work on a project, there's usually quite a big dependency on someone to fully understand the role of an ERP and fully document things. But I guess nowadays, and we were talking about this a bit earlier, I think I've probably had the best results by trying to outsource as much as possible. I think I feel like today's like middleware providers is a really good modern approach for integrations. You're essentially investing in one central place where all of your data is coming into, it's easier to clean that data and then pass it on to other systems. It reduces the overheads when you want to add in different systems. I think there's a lot of value in that approach. And then I think there's some really good providers that can layer on professional services to really take some of the pain away for a project. And for me, it's just taking, probably the most painful piece, and particularly like when we go into a project and we take on more than we would like to, the first thing I will try and do is give someone responsibility for that. It makes the project cleaner.
Yeah, I agree. Every project I've worked on a decent sized business where ERP is a core integration point, one of the first things I say is ERP integration will be the most likely thing that will delay your project and add cost and complexity. Do we have a solution specialist on the ERP side who is able to provide that integration expertise and make sure that work stream is managed and be a conduit into the e-commerce development agency? Some e-commerce agencies are very good and have got lots of experience of ERP integrations. They have, they've done the flows on leading platforms, whether it's Dynamics, Nav, whatever it might be. and that's great. Others haven't done so much. And we talked about this before about different ecosystems around different platforms where agencies have different levels of competency. So yeah, I think the middleware bit's an important point. Seen a client using a middleware like Saltbox, and everything goes through that, and they trust and they have a good relationship, and therefore that integration spec work is done, and the client is reassured that they're going to make sure the data exchanges are working. And then I guess you've said, in the Shopify space, using like integration specialists like Patchworks. There are specialist integrators like Telescopic who focus on coming up with the right solutions for clients. So do you typically find that it's about using middleware, or it's just about having an integration specialist, or both together?
I'm a massive fan of middleware because I think I think there's usually a huge opportunity of integration. So often people might have like an API integration or black files, whatever, and there's a load of workarounds in place. And I think when you go down the middleware route, you have the ability to add in logic. So in the Shopify space in particular, we've found like managing a single source of inventory across multiple Shopify stores, it makes it a lot easier. Things like pre-orders, various other things. And the other thing is like, I think when it comes to like BI and data warehousing, if you've got that kind of clean data coming into that middleware platform, it makes it a lot easier to just pass it out. And, it just makes the whole thing a lot cleaner. And I think the other thing is it just makes it more likely that people end up improving the integrations as well. I feel like most people have got, additional levels of integration they want to add in. So it might be that they want to eventually use their integration as more advanced kind of PIM or PLM. And I think that if you've got that kind of piece of middleware in the middle, it just reduces like the amount of time that needs to go into that. And it just feels like with our clients, anyone that's got that there, and I also think it's kind of, they've got a best in class piece of technology that's, maybe they're pushing the client as well. And, they're constantly communicating the potential alternative approaches. I just think it's a better way to operate today.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess one other bit of mitigating this risk is front loading in discovery phases, the integration stuff around stock, product data, customer data, and having the technical counterparts from ERP and e-commerce and whoever else in your business in the IT side to really map out those flows and processes and look at what you're trying to achieve, and wherever possible using standard connectors and flows to minimize the amount of custom coding and custom API work. So I think that's really important. Leaving it too late in the discovery, you suddenly realize that, well, actually, you've put more pressure into the development phase now by not addressing some of the issues up front. So the next one for me, in terms of common risk, is unrealistic kind of requirements for launch and scope creep. So I see this a lot where people won't have an MVP mentality. It's just constantly, we want this, or this will be good. And you just see the requirements just getting up and up and up and up and up and up and up, but there isn't any prioritization. There isn't any criteria that sits behind it saying, what's the rationale? Why are we doing this stuff? How do we ensure that we've only prioritized things that we need to do? And MVP, or minimum viable product, if you haven't come across it before, is such an important way to say, what can we live with on day one? What can come later in like a fast follow continuous optimization program? But one area where it's hard to land is sometimes in brand organizations where MVP is anathema to brand and creative people, because they want to deliver the best UX. They want the brand to excel and to deliver something unique that sets them apart in the market. And if you try and talk about MVP, the shutters come down. So sometimes the risk is about landing a point in the right language to align with the culture of the business, but getting them to understand that what you're trying to do is protect the brand and its presentation by enabling you to go live with an improved customer experience, but that you can't do everything at once. And I think that's such a critical thing to address early on, getting buy-in to phasing and being able to couch it in the right language so that people internally will buy into it and it's not a barrier later.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is just getting everyone bought into it. Because I think these days, when you go through a replatforming project, there's so many shiny things. So I think a good example is the middleware platform. So that partner will want you to use all of their features. They will want you to, improve where you are currently so that you become an advocate of the product. If you change ESP and you move to Klaviyo, they'll want you to do different things. If you use Yotpo or whoever else, they'll want you to use as much as possible out of the product. And I think that's often where those kind of distractions and deviations come in. And there'll be certain stakeholders that, really buy into that idea. And then suddenly exactly that, you're not working with MVP anymore, at least you're not kind of working towards that with anything else being a luxury. I had a project recently where we were using a middleware provider, and my goal was very much replicate exactly what we have right now with the ERP and the e-commerce platform. And then suddenly there's a number of people that are trying to use this middleware platform to handle a number of other integrations, enrich the integration between the ERP and the e-com platform, rebuild the integration of the 3PR. And it's just completely unnecessary for the first phase of the project. And I think particularly when there's like a CapEx budget as well and people want to get the most out of it, I think this is a really hard thing. And I think this again comes down to the role of a PM and a project lead to really push everyone from the start and all the way through that, set expectations as well. It's the big change. We need to get it over the line and then we can benefit from it and start to, improve all these different areas. But I think it's a really important point and a really hard one to get right.
Yeah, agreed. I think your point about budget is spot on, because budget can actually help constrain overzealous and overexcitement by, we've nailed down and agreed with the finance lead that the budget is £300,000 and we cannot go over it. We have gone through and defined everything. If we do everything, it's 450,000. We can't do everything. So I often work with people on it's like a good, better, best, and then it's like a pick and mix. And I start with compliance and accessibility. Got to have those. If you're not PCI compliant, well, A, you're open to malicious hacker, but also B, you are open to a lot of potential fraud issues. So that's critical. That can't be up for debate. Then it's what does the business and the customers currently rely on that can't be lost? That's got to be in. What are the bugs and issues that are impacting the ability to sell and to service customers? They need to be fixed because we don't want to replicate errors. Now that's our kind of like starting point. And then it's what are the enhancements? And then it's almost like this pick mix is right. Well, let's work through those first ones. If we can't not have those, where are we up to? What budget have we got left? And then within each of the enhancements, it helps get them to think good, better, best. So for Wishlist, can you live with a simple wish list to start off with, which doesn't have the ability to have shared wish lists where people can shop from them and buy an item from your wish list for you as a gift, the full like Amazon wish list versus a functional e-com one. And then where would phase 2 for wish list be? And then actually you can take maybe what is a £3,000 cost on wish list and turn it into a £1,000 launch cost with a £2,000 continuous optimization program roadmap item.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's just making sure you get the foundations right and then you can benefit long term from getting those right tools in place.
Yeah.
What is Amplience? In a word, it's freedom. The freedom to build a digital experience as limitless as your vision. Create, preview, schedule, and manage all your content in one easy place. Find out more at amplience.com. Amplience. Experience freedom.
Right, I'm going to throw the ultimate bone to you here for leaping on, mate. Content readiness. Over to you.
Yeah, I think this is the big one for me. I think it's usually the one that slows things down, because it might not be that it slows the whole project down. It might be that it slows UAT down, for example, or certain aspects of the build. And I think content is so easily underestimated, because changing platform can mean completely, for example, if you move from pretty standardized templates in Magento, but you're moving to Shopify and you need to rebuild everything in sections, or, you know, if it's a headless build and you've got headless CMS, like I feel like, and often people underestimate migrating blog content, and various other things. Size guides is often a big one. Like I think that content, that kind of audit for the content migration at the start is one of the most important phases, because that's a really important line in the kind of Gantt chart that is really often either missed or underestimated. And actually, you know, that can require months of manual effort to get it right. And I think it's really key. So as you've put here, map the content types and need. Audit is really important. So and I think content doesn't always mean content pages and blog posts as well. Like there can be a lot more to that. And, you know, like I say, size guides, it might be things that are stored within the account. It might be things that are purely admin related. Like, I think that's a really, really important thing to get right at the start of the project.
Yeah, I agree. It's huge. People underestimate it all the time. And it's really hard to get people to understand. You are, through your design phase, most likely going to change your templates, which will have an impact on product imagery. Is the classic one, isn't it? Yeah. And it's, we've got to reformat them because the auto crop on mobile has just screwed the position of the image and it doesn't look good. Or actually, we created an amazing template that has landscape with portrait. But on mobile, we've now got the landscape one, which is number one image, looking tiny in the viewable pane, because it's optimized to viewport. We didn't think that through. We've now got to rethink our image. There's so many nuances to this, and a lot of it comes out of the design, but I agree, it's starting it as early as possible. So many people leave it to the end, don't they? And it's just like, oh shit, we've got to do all the images. So now start right. You can start it all before development starts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next one we got is UAT testing. So basically what I like to call getting shit done to go live is, so the key thing I think is people underestimate, again, like the content, user acceptance testing is, it's not the developers doing their code testing, it's you going onto the front end and also checking back-end processes. And this is where people come unstuck. They look at it and go, I looked at the website, and most people still have this nasty habit of checking on desktop, even if 70% of traffic's mobile.
Desktop crime.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to check on desktop, on the top browsers, on mobile devices, and check. So you've got to check everything on different devices. But you're not just checking the front end in terms of all the images look good, all the menus work. You're checking all the functional elements of it. So when I'm adding to basket, when I'm removing from basket, if I'm in a wish list and I'm adding to the basket, if I'm moving from basket to wish list, if I'm on a product list page and I'm adding a filter, I'm removing a filter, I'm adding multiple filters. Is the user experience right? Am I seeing the right products? Is it doing the right things to the URLs? And then also you've got the other stuff like, actually, if you've got SEO controls based on index, no index, is the SEO person checking that the right URLs get an index? Then you've got back-end processes such as someone signed up for email. Great, it worked on the front end. The message looked good. Did the email request get through? Is the right email address? Has it got the right opt-in flag? Have they received the right opt-in confirmation email? With payments, you've got to trust every single payment option, shipping destination, got to check taxes, and you suddenly realise it's absolutely mind-bogglingly massive amount of tests. And the mitigation is this: is you've got to have someone who owns it internally to coordinate, because it requires everyone. You've got to start creating test scripts way in advance when UAT begins. Work with your agency partner. Do they have standard test scripts? Most of them do. Piggyback that. That's your starting point. But be iterative. Don't leave UAT to the end and go and say, right, 1 month before launch, smash the site. Right the way through development, when anything's released into the front end and you've got access to your stage environment, start your UAT straight away when it's in a meaningful state. I always advise split into two halves UAT. Project team UAT, business stakeholder UAT. Project team does the early iterations of staging, where you know it's going to be a pretty sparse and not very pretty site, just to get core functional elements debriefed so that the coding's better. And then once the content is in and the site's looking more like it does a customer-facing site, then you get the business stakeholders to test their areas of it. Because if they see a site that looks ugly, instantly get a demotivation element, which is really hard to recover. So I think those are my key things. Plus, having an internal briefing and being clear on what you want people to do and why and when and how much effort's required. Like, we need half an hour a day from you over the next 2 weeks. Just be really concise about it. Where's your head at on the UAT testing and how you reduce that risk?
Yeah, I think you've said most things. I think a lot of the best test scripts will usually come as a result of like documentation being really strong up front. And I think a lot of people build out at least the front end, or in fact all of the kind of test scripts off the back of like having really detailed like acceptance criteria, or just detail in a set of functional requirements or a kind of initial spec. I think that really helps. Yeah, the earlier the better, setting that up, getting people bought into it. I think our average project, usually, particularly working with the SaaS platforms now, you'll start off, so you can migrate, you can start building the product catalog and everything else and configuring third parties really early, but you'll be doing so on like a default blank theme. And you can start to test certain elements then. I think getting the order and customer data in as early as possible and start to test that mid-project is good. Integrations, final UAT, really good. And then when the agency, typically the way that we work with people, again, more recently, and this isn't necessarily the best way to work, but they'll then give us the theme and we'll have like, I don't know, 2-3 week UAT period. And then you want to be free from all the other testing to focus on that kind of front end testing, all like anything from like promotions to, everything else you mentioned. And then I personally think that's how a lot of projects work now. But then equally, we did do a project recently where everything was delivered in 2 week sprints, and then we were testing as we went. But the only difficulty with that is quite often you still need that 2 week UAT period at the end to test everything together. But I mean, I think the key thing is just trying to phase it, like you say, get the back end and content stuff out as quickly as possible, just so that you can test properly when it comes to that final UAT phase. And then going back to content, the timing of content is key so that you can properly UAT. Same with configuration of third parties. Like, quite often I see people testing things when the site's not ready to test, but it's more on the internal task. And then they don't realize that actually there's issues with the search overlay or issues with certain templates or all of that stuff. But I think you've covered the majority, to be perfectly honest, obviously. Yeah,
that's good builds on that. Actually, the critical thing is don't get people to test stuff when their part of it isn't fit for purpose. You've got to have an oversight that says, okay, we've like the payment side, okay, checkout, just very quick. Is it really? Are the payment methods working? Because if they're not, you fix that at a code level before you go and do the UAT. Otherwise, it's your UAT board is full of stuff you know is broken anyway. So what have you learned? The other thing that's critical is having a test result log, because there's nothing worse, unless you're a tiny business, in which case it's so easy for you to just do it via messaging. If you've got 6, 7, 8 stakeholders dumping emails across going, I saw this doesn't work, or this wasn't expected, deciphering that and deduplicating it is an absolute headache. Having a log where people can dump stuff in and you've got all the test criteria listed out with ID numbers on them, so people will then log in the ID number of the test that's failed and what the failure is and what browser, etc. they're on, and having that so that you can quickly go through and say, well, actually, I've got 4 failed for 2.4. Are they the same or are they different? It's really, really helpful, because one of the best things you can do to help a development partner is to take away the noise. When you're getting into the end point of testing and bug fixing ready for launch, what you don't need is a development team slow down, because they've got to decipher all the junk that's chucked into test results. So filter that stuff out, make sure everything that goes in for triage is genuine issues that need fixing, and use a process for the triage. So Trello boards are great. I know people who use a similar process in things like ClickUp, where it is new, and then it gets queued into P1, P2, P3. Then it's ready to get in development, in sprint, ready for UAT, recheck, passed or refail, goes back into the appropriate one. Just have a process and a structure so that you don't end up with 100 emails trying to work out, oh Christ, which one am I acting on next?
Yeah. So I think one other thing you can do to get ahead of yourself in terms of reducing the number of bugs and issues being raised is set expectations with the agency early in terms of those device and browser combinations. I think a lot of agencies still maybe definitely test internally on desktop Chrome, mobile Safari, etc. And I think getting those into the scope of work can be really beneficial, and just making sure that it's clear which ones are a priority.
Excellent. And the last one we're going to cover today, and we're not saying we've exhaustively covered every single bit of risk, but we're focusing on the most important project risks that you should de-risk, is something you mentioned earlier, Paul, attitude, and getting into a combative, blaming mentality. Do you want to talk us through that one? Because I think this is really interesting too.
Yeah, I just think that it's a really important thing. It's more the client side, to be perfectly honest. I think quite often, minor things go wrong and, a client will just start throwing the agency under the bus or, having a go at the agency contact. And I think ultimately for a replatforming project, you need to keep everyone motivated, the agency included. And it's really important to think about things from their perspective. And, they might be losing money on things or, things might be taking longer than expected. There might be external variables. And I think it's just thinking beyond we've signed off this scope of work. And it's more thinking, how do I get everyone working together all the way through the project to get the best result? Because I think demotivated agencies and developers will just result in further conflict and friction. And it can usually be avoided.
Yeah, 100%. Nothing really to add on that other than your own personal happiness in a project. If you're constantly in a shouting match, it's a miserable experience because it doesn't get better. Screaming and shouting at someone doesn't fix an issue. Like stress is a key part of a project. And stress management is a key part of a project. And I've worked with people in the past where one of the owners is just the instant reaction is to scream and shout at people and blame, and all it does is to get people behind the doors going, I don't want to work with them. I'm not interested. I can't be bothered. And it also, what it means is when something's genuinely serious, you just get desensitized to it because you think, it's another rant. I'm not listening. I'm not bothered. And then you miss important things that really need to be acted on quickly. So you've got to be very careful. Shouting to let off steam is fine, but screaming at other people and blaming them constantly is negative as hell.
And I think it's like project teams changing on the agency side is something that you ideally want to avoid as well. Like quite often, the more you complain about, the more likely that is to happen. But be it that the person doesn't want to work on the project or the agency wants to assign someone new. But that results in further issues quite often. So I think it's just about thinking about how you escalate an issue.
Yes.
Like you say, just only really raising the high priority one.
Yeah, I always advise, and it's a two-way street, but my advice is always behave how you want to be behaved to backwards. What service do you expect? This is a partnership. This isn't just a I buy, you do. This is a strategic partnership because this is your e-commerce revenue. And often it's your omni-channel revenue. So you get from a partnership what you put in. And if you start on a negative basis, it's very hard to recover that. So I 100% agree. Go in with a positive attitude. Don't accept crap and push back and be firm, but be firm in a polite and respectful way, because you'll tend to find that people will walk a mile for you if you show them respect.
Yeah, and I think the thing as well to remember is it's a significant cost to move an agency. There's so much cost to it, be it all the contentious issues, all the blaming from the agency, the cost of onboarding, the time cost of not doing the things that you should be doing for the next 2 months.
Grass is always greener, right? It's that classic. Nobody is perfect. None of us. I can't be perfect in every project I do, and there'll be things that I could do better. And you move from one partner to another, you'll find other things you don't like there that weren't in play in your previous one, and you're shifting the problem. The problem is relationship management. Yeah. So don't shift the problem, address the problem.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let's stop there because we've rambled on quite well on quite a few topics. Hopefully this has been really useful for people. We're sharing our experience. We've worked on tons of projects, so we're picking out the biggest risks, and hopefully that's some good practical advice on how you can address them and things to do. But thank you for listening. Keep an ear open for our next episode. We drop one every Tuesday. Do let us know of any topics you'd love us to cover or really cool guests you think would be good on the podcast. And we'd love you to subscribe and rate us on Apple or Spotify. Until next week, dear friends.
For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.